Alrighty, let's get this set up and working. All right, so it looks like there are a couple of you already watching. Anything you put over in the chat window on the side, I will be able to see and read and respond to and so on. That's kind of how I'm planning on responding to questions and stuff. On my end anyway, it looks like everything's working. Can you hear me at all, Tanya? Can you hear me when I speak and say things and so on? On my end, it looks like the microphone's working. Awesome. Thanks. So yeah, we won't officially get started just yet since we still have a couple of minutes. And there's only 2 of you. And of course, I want to allow for more people. But we are technically live, so this is how the whole thing will work. I don't think there's anything I can do about lighting, so I'm just going to have to be extra pale this evening. But yeah. This moment before the actual live review starts always reminds me of that period right before classes start in a classroom. I never quite know what to say to all that. Because some teachers will intentionally actually come in at the last moment. To go ahead and answer your question, Tanya, yes, the final will be the exact same format as the midterm. There will be no surprises on format there. I'll dig into things a little bit more detail once we actually get started in another minute or 2. Again, the video is being recorded at the moment, so anybody who watches it after the fact can see it. But I'll let people trickle in and I'll probably answer the question again. But the short version is yes, it's exactly the same. It's a set of essay questions responding to a prompt, having you apply the concepts we've been talking about. Instead of doing a couple of different scenarios, I believe I've set the final up. I say believe because I've done a few of these over the last few years. This one's a single scenario that you then start responding to. But like I said, once we officially get started here in just 1 second, I'll go over that in a little more detail. Let's see. Well, my watch is like a full 5 minutes behind, actually. 7 on the dot. Good thing I've got my phone. And, you know, the internet. All right, so there are 5 of you. That is 7 o'clock on the dot. So we'll call this the official start of the review. So welcome, those of y'all that can make it. Those of you who are watching in the future, hello. Hopefully you enjoyed the basketball game or whatever else you might have had going on. Hopefully it was nothing too terrible. And, you know, boiler up, go Purdue, all that good stuff. So there's a chat window off to the side. Anything you type in there, I can see and, of course, respond to. So any and all questions you have, feel free to put them up there. I will answer anything and everything I can as first come, first serve just literally going down the list and responding to as many questions as I can. I'll be online for literally the next hour, whether we have one person or all 84 of you here for the review. I will be here answering questions or at least talking and discussing things. So people in the future, I don't know if while watching the video you can actually see the chat. I couldn't on my end when I looked at things, so I'll try and repeat questions as I see them. We have one already that a few of you have already heard me answer, but just going down the list first. Will the final be the same format as the midterm? Yes, exact same format. There will be a set of short essay questions having you respond to and apply the concepts you looked at for the readings and everything. And yeah, it's literally the exact same thing as the midterm. Rather than the midterm having two different scenarios you had to respond to, this one is a longer scenario with multiple questions built off of it, but it's the exact same thing. You read the scenario, you read the questions, you answer them. You're doing argumentative essays where you are presenting a thesis and supporting that position, answering that question by giving arguments, and you will be asked to reference and explain a couple of the vocab terms and concepts exactly like the midterm. Whatever you did for the midterm should work for the final. Going down comments. Awesome. I'm glad that the chat works on your end. My only wonder if whether or not you can see the questions is for the people seeing the recording after the fact, because I've not seen the chat archives on recorded live streams before. Going down the list is awesome. Biggest mistakes students made on the midterm. The biggest one, honestly, the most frequent mistake was detail. So if you go back to the grading rubric, which I've posted on Blackboard and linked to a couple of times, I think it's both in Unit 4 and there's a link to it in the final unit, like checklist of things. The grading rubric there gives the set of criteria I use for giving the different letter grades. And I simply convert those over into percentage scores as per the syllabus and all that. So the biggest thing that I wrote over and over as far as feedback goes was amount of detail. So a lot of people got B's and C's on the midterm in that they gave solid arguments that hit all the high points of the various positions. And they talked about the main gist of each of the concepts they referred to. Their logic didn't have any massive gaps, where at most it had one single large gap in reasoning, a single question that ought to have been asked. But the biggest thing that kept people from having A-level responses was they left out a lot of detail or nuance or explanation in their different arguments and in their explanations of the position. So there is no minimum length or requirement for the way you get graded. A very short response that has a lot of detail and nuance to it can get an A just as well as a long essay can. But take, for example, one of the midterm questions, which had you look at hobbits and Mordor and a fictional war scenario that was a thinly veiled reference to Lord of the Rings. In that scenario, a lot of y'all referred to the jus ad bellum, the principles of when it is morally permissible to go to war according to just war theory. And a lot of y'all would reference or list the different principles or the conditions discussed by the jus ad bellum. But you might have just literally thrown out a sentence or a phrase saying, according to this is when it's okay. These four are met, so it's okay. You never explain why and how those four are met and what that means for the end result. Literally just saying these four are met is not the same as explaining how and why those are met and why those are relevant to the final conclusion. So the biggest thing that was missing from essay responses was detail, similar to that. Going down the list, is the exam cumulative? Technically, yes. However, it does stress the post-midterm units, so that's 5, 6, and 7, far more than it does the initial ones. So overall, yes, the final is cumulative in that it can, in theory, ask about anything from the whole semester. However, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, focus on the final 3 units. You'll need to be familiar with the basics of the first half of the semester, with concepts like what an argument is, what a valid argument is, what a moral theory is, and those kinds of things, but expect the material to focus on the second half of the semester. Starting to address Lucy's questions. Why should moral theories fit our intuitions when possible if moral theories are supposed to focus on what's right or wrong in general versus what an individual thinks? Awesome question. Yours is one of the first content questions. Let me address the next couple that are about format, and I'll come back to the one on content. So give me 1 second on that. I'll work backwards since a few of y'all are responding on the same sorts of things right here. So is there a recommended length for responses? Or would I rather you be concise or extra explanation? There is no required length. Grading is not based on length at all. I don't ask that of you. It doesn't go into how I actually award grades. When in concise is perfectly fine. However, do not assume that you've made something obvious or clear or that I can get what you mean. When in doubt, be more clear. If you think, oh, this is obvious, he'll know what I mean, or I think I've said this well enough, but I've still got an hour left in the exam, always feel free to explain more, make your point more clearly, and go through and reread your response at the end. And this is recommendations on my part for doing better and getting closer to like a perfect or A-level response on these sorts of things. There is no required length, but if you reread it and a reasonable person who has not taken the class couldn't follow along with what you're saying, there's probably a few places you could go into greater detail. If you can fully show that you understand and appreciate both the problem that I've presented to you and the various concepts and positions that I'm asking you to reference and explain, if you can show a full appreciation of those and show that you get not just the highlights, like the bullet points on a PowerPoint slide, but the nuance of them, you'll have that much better of a response. Working back up, just clarifying a few of these. Logan, you're hitting a lot of the nice details about how the essays and the grading work. I'll get to those in just 1 second. If I don't go down the list, I'm going to lose track of everything. So putting Lucy's question on hold because it's content related. David, going off of what Adriel said, will the questions focus more on the material after the midterm or more from the whole semester? After the midterm, as I said. What would I consider a minor and a major issue with an essay response? That's a good one because it's included with the grading rubric. So as far as major and minor issues, I think there's some discussion of this on the second page of the rubric, if I remember. But in general, a major issue is something like, is there a large gap in reasoning, as in something about? Like, for example, if you lay out, take the Mordor and Hobbit question again. If you lay out how Mordor's invasion of the Shire fits 4 of the conditions for a permissible war for the jus ad bellum, and then you say, however, I believe they're not fighting going to war. That's a major issue. There's a large gap in reasoning where you go from one set of evidence to a conclusion, and there's no way for me to see how you actually made the jump from here to here. So that sort of thing counts as a major issue. Other major issues are, did you miss the general idea of a concept or a vocabulary term? This class, is kind of designed to not be rock your world difficult. The material and the concepts can be difficult to wrap your mind around. The class, on the other hand, is not. I try not to drown you in super technical vocabulary that you can't keep straight. I try not to drown you in the minutia of arguments because this is a 100-level class. You're taking it online. You've got other things to worry about. In greater detail is just for upper-level philosophy classes where you can continue diving into them, or we can get to it as we need to. That said, that kind of makes it all the more important for you to get the major details of things right. Take, for example, species egalitarianism or something out of the animal ethics and environmental ethics unit. If you were to say that species egalitarianism says that we should treat every species differently, that's the literal opposite meaning of the original view. That counts as a major issue. You fundamentally misunderstood one of the concepts we're working with. So these are the kinds of things that I look for as major issues in a paper, either large gaps in reasoning or major confusions or misunderstandings of the concepts we're dealing with. Minor issues are lesser versions of all the rest. Minor issues are things like, didn't explain this well enough, or I see what your overall argument is, but I miss, say, a small step here or there where you go from a minor point to a minor point. If you were to mix up a couple of terms, but you demonstrate throughout the essay that you do know which one is which, the typo where you swapped the names is a minor issue. These are the sorts of things I look for those. So yeah, I think I still give some description of this on the second page of that grading rubric. So you should be able to see this in writing. But yeah, that's the gist of how I decide those. Unfortunately, grading essays does have at least some subjective components to it. But with the rubric and me showing you what I use to evaluate the essays, hopefully we're at least on the same page about how I give the grades that I do and try and have as much structure and objectivity to it as I can without going into, oh, it should have been 1 point higher on this and 1 point higher on this and so on. The level of minutia that we'll just argue forever about after the fact. Is there a time limit on the final? Yes. Just like with the midterm, it will tell you when you initially start the exam. It should let you know that you've got 2 hours to complete it. It is 120 minutes from the moment you start it. You only have one attempt. And at the end of those 120 minutes, it will submit whatever you have in those boxes. So a few different people had technical issues with the midterm. That is probably a good like 10 or 12 of you had Blackboard cut out in the middle of things, your connection got interrupted or something. So there's a few different points where there are technical issues. So what I recommend as a purely pragmatic basis, you don't have to do this, but just a recommendation. If you're worried about losing connection or you're worried about having issues, technically speaking, with the exam, copy and paste the prompts out of Blackboard and into a Word document or something like that, and then write your responses there and paste them back into Blackboard. That way, if Blackboard does cut out on you, as it unfortunately does because it's a terrible, terrible system. Thank God Purdue's looking at changing to something else, I think, next year. That way, if something does happen, you can, at the end of the day, send me the Word document or whatever else you typed it in, and I can make sure you still get credit. Because once you start the exam, Blackboard does keep a record of it. I can see how long you spent on there. If something went wrong with it, generally it'll show me you spent 0 minutes on the exam. You opened it and it immediately closed or crashed or whatever. That's the usual way that ends up looking if you've had some sort of an issue with it. So if you email me and say, hey, it cut out on me, this is when I started it, this is when I finished, here are my responses, I'll like 99% of the time accept that. I do not prefer it. Do not default to that. Please do it through Blackboard if at all possible. But if everything goes wrong, I will make sure you still get credit for it. That covers format questions. We're starting to get back to content questions. So before I jump to those, any other questions about the way the exam works? We can wait just a second and let people type those in because I know you can't just chime in the way we would in a classroom. You can say 1 more minute for any format, how the exam works type questions to show up. Just a few more moments in case. If not, that's fine. Well, we can start getting to the other stuff as well. Okay, so let's jump on over to the 2 content questions. So let me get back to Lucy's question as promised a few minutes ago, and then I'll go down again the list as they show up, first come, first serve. Yes, 2 essays. I believe so. It could be there's a third question, but overall, if there are that many, they're shorter and they're all about a single scenario this time rather than multiple. No, there is not any extra credit. Overall, honestly, let's be real. I've inflated your grades enough, considering that the journals are completion grades. There should be enough buffer overall to your grades that how you do on the exam will not totally sink you. Overall, you guys have been doing well in the class. You had excellent responses to the midterm on average. And the journals and things are there to help sort of offset the heavy weight of the exams. So I don't offer any extra credit. For one, there's just not a whole lot of time to offer that right now. I know you'll have a million other things to do, and it's another thing for me to have to grade and look at. So no extra credit. Let the journals sort of take away any fear you might have of the exam. You should be all right overall if you've been keeping up with your homework. Again, Lucy, I promise I'm answering your question. So if those of you who are following along in the chat bar are looking, Lucy asked a little bit ago, why should moral theories fit our intuitions when possible if moral theories are supposed to focus on what is right or wrong in general versus what an individual thinks? Which is a fantastic, like, meta-ethical question. If you remember back to when we talked a little bit about the different branches of ethics, this is a really good one about how ethics works and why we approach it in the way that we do. So in general, my answer, and one that I think our textbook goes over in some detail, is that moral theories, that is, attempts to explain what things are right or wrong and why, these are not like scientific theories in the sense that scientific theories do actually have empirical data that we can look at to help verify different things. For example, scientific theories try and make sense of and explain what's going on and why these various physical, observable things happen. Unfortunately, while ethics involves things that people do physically do, if I stab somebody in the chest, this is a physical action that can be observed and replicated and everything else. But the fact that stabbing somebody in the face is wrong, that part's not actually observable. People can look at it and people can feel things about it and they can think things about it. I can watch a murder happen and say, that's a terrible, terrible thing. But I can't actually, with my physical senses, observe the wrongness directly. So ethics is the sort of thing that simply doesn't have empirical evidence to work with. We don't have data in the same sense that the natural sciences do, or even that the social sciences do. So instead, ethics really has a very small set of data to work with. And some of the most accessible data we have to work with are our moral intuitions. That is, if you want to rephrase our intuitions as our pre-theoretical notions, is the way that's sometimes phrased in philosophy. The idea being we have ways that we think about morality that just seem direct, obvious to us. These are the things that we think instinctually or without having to do a lot of theoretical analysis about things. Like if I were to stab your mother in the face, you would probably think that that's morally wrong. You wouldn't have to think about it long. You wouldn't have to consider it. You wouldn't have to ask some dead white guy whether or not it's wrong to stab your mother in the face. You just know, or at least you think you know, that it's wrong to do that sort of thing. This is one of the things that I consider to be a moral intuition, or that we've been referring to as a moral intuition. These sorts of things do differ from culture to culture. You're right. And they do differ from individual to individual. We're trying to move past that. And we're trying to get at what morality is actually like, at least if any form of objectivism is true. That said, while we're trying to get beyond feelings and beyond individual opinion, we have to start with something. So those moral intuitions are the best set of data that we have to start with. So when we try and come up with a moral theory, or that is an explanation about what things are right and wrong and why, for one, we have to start with something. We have to come up with some set of data that we want our theories to be able to explain. And part of that's going to be our moral intuitions. Secondly, our theories should try and fit our intuitions as much as possible, because we generally want to assume that most people are not 100% mistaken about what morality is actually like. So we want to be able to correct and adjust our intuitions. 100 years ago, racism would have been included in a lot of those moral intuitions. So there are many cases where we want to say, no, our intuitions, our common sense views about morality can be dead absolutely wrong. But we don't want to throw out all of what we think about morality already. So theories should try and preserve as much of our intuitions as possible and change only those that we have good reason to change, like rejecting racism because we have good reason to think that all people are actually equal. Or we can have good arguments about that, or we can ask people and get their experiences and use those as part of our data to help build moral theories. So moral theories have to work with something, and that's something, at least a good starting place, are our moral intuitions. And if you have a theory that rejects all of our intuitions, that gives us really good reason to reject the theory. Another way maybe to think about it is in terms of theoretical costs, a concept I've referred to over and over throughout the semester. If I propose a theory about morality, and that theory says that things like rape, stealing, murder, cheating on your ethics exam, if all of these things are perfectly A-okay on my theory, which is more likely to be true? That theory is correct, and that, and therefore that murder and rape and stealing and all that's correct, or my intuitions are correct and that theory is a shitty theory? Which of those two is more likely? Most of us would probably say, no, given how obvious it is to me that rape and murder and theft and cheating on your exam, given how obvious it is to me that those things are wrong, that gives me good reason to reject the theory. The costs of the theory are high enough that I should throw out the theory instead of throwing out my intuitions, if that makes any sense. From there, I've got the one other content question to get to so far. Y'all can keep raising them. I will keep answering them. But does that help with the moral intuition theory, Lucy? Because I am not drowning in follow-up questions, I'm going to assume that we're okay for the moment. If you have it, if something isn't explained well, or you want to go into more detail about something, if there's something I've not said in the right way or in a way that works, please feel free to keep asking over here. I will keep trying to get to it. In the meantime, to make the best use of our time, I'll go ahead and move over to Adriel's question about the important parts of the harm principle. So, can I explain the important parts of the harm principle? Yes. So the harm principle is something that comes up with our most recent unit, which is intentionally very short and kind of cursory. But the basic idea goes like this. The harm principle is a general idea that comes from the philosopher John Stuart Mill, that is utilitarian consequentialist from the 18th century, who was writing in Britain. And the general idea is that the harm principle is the general idea that we can do whatever we want so long as we don't actually harm other people. And we can phrase this in two different ways. Mill originally presents this idea, which seems intuitive and obvious to a lot of us. Mill originally presents this idea in the context of politics. He's talking about when is it okay for a state, for a nation, a government, a society to use its power to influence and meddle and interfere with people's lives. And he says that the only time that that's okay, the only time when it's okay for us to be restricted and stopped, the only time it's okay for somebody to go in and say, that's not an all right thing to do, the only time that that's justified is when that power is being used, when that banning or when those laws are being used to stop one person from hurting another. And that fact says something about, the kind of freedom and rights and everything else that we have. It's a way of phrasing what is okay for us to do. if it's justified to use power to limit people when they try and hurt each other, that says that it's not okay for one person to harm another. So harm becomes the new criterion for determining when things are okay or not okay to do. And it's a really permissive concept. It says that everything's okay so long as it doesn't hurt somebody else. And while he phrases it in a public context, that is in the context of how should we organize societies, we can take away from that private moral ideas. That is, things that affect us on a personal level, that say on a personal individual level, you can do whatever you want so long as you don't harm other people, which is why in the lectures I mentioned that there's two ways of phrasing the harm principle: a public way that uses the same context that Mill originally presents it in, and the personal side where we can, infer, that's the word I'm looking for, that we can infer things about personal level morality, the morality of individuals. So you asked, what are the important parts of the harm principle? I would say the important parts of it are, you need to know that it says you can do whatever you want as long as you don't hurt others. You need to know that it comes in two different flavors, two different ways of phrasing the same concept, not two different concepts, but two ways of expressing the same idea. And that those two ways are a public way, that is a way that deals with societies and laws and people in general, and a personal way of phrasing it, a way that says things about individual morality. Those are the basics of what the principle is. You also need to know that while a lot of people take it as being obviously true, that yeah, you can do whatever you want so long as you don't hurt others. While some people take this as obviously true, you also need to know that while it does a lot, while it's, again, has a lot of things going for it theoretically, there are also issues with it. There are objections to it. And these are where we start getting into things with like the offense principle and all that sort of good stuff. Does that help explain the gist of it? Any follow-up questions for that one? Yes, that helps explain things, or yes, there's still questions you would like to ask about it. I'm good either way. I just want to make sure that I'm actually explaining things the way that it's helpful. Okay, awesome. So that hits the questions I've gotten so far. Anything else you guys would like me to go over? It is currently 7:29. I promised I would be here for an hour, so we still got another half an hour of hanging out. If you don't have any questions and you truly don't care, you don't have to stick around for the whole thing. Again, this is not an actual in-person class. So, I can't, for one, I couldn't keep you here one way or the other. You can, have me talking to an empty room and go to the bathroom or whatever, and I'd never know the difference. But yeah. Glad it was helpful. If you wanted to see responses to the midterms, the way you could do that. Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. I have access to everything you've done. So I click on your midterm attempt and I can view it through the Grade Center, where I have this whole nice, looks like a ripped off Excel spreadsheet, and I can click through to your individual submissions. I know that if, based on what other people have told me from your side of things, because I only have a sample student I can use to click through. I can't actually view something from one of your specific perspectives. I just have this very generic student that has done nothing, and so I can't look at filled out responses, and it resets like every day or after everything that it does, so I can't type a response and go back and look at it. So this is speculative, but this is my guess for how you could go back and look to it. If you were to go to My Grades, there, you might be able to click on the individual submission for the midterm there and view your attempt through My Grades. Or if you go back to the midterm, I know that if you click on it, it will, for some of you anyway, have mentioned that it'll start trying to show, like, have you taken again, but you've used all your attempts. But it looks like you can do it if you click on your midterm. So if you click on your midterm, you can view your attempts and see the comments. So fantastic. And I'm glad that the comments are finally showing. Apparently, feedback, grades, and comments just didn't show for the longest time. So I'm sorry about that. I don't know what on earth happened. I think it has to do with the framework of the assignment. But I think I've got that fixed. So you should be able to go through and see what I said about it. Given that between you guys and my other online class, there are well over 100 of you. The comments that I made are short, I will admit, but a few of you have already set up office hour appointments and things for us to go over stuff in detail. I'd be happy to keep on doing that if you'd like me to elaborate on those. And yes, Lucy, thank you for sharing all of that. Awesome, good. There was another question I missed. Any topics that I think you should focus on? Short version is focus on the stuff that we've talked about after the midterm. So that's units 5, 6, and 7. 7's very short. It's literally the 2 lectures, the overview plus one in somewhat greater detail. Those 3 units, 5, 6, and 7, would be the ones I recommend you focus on. As far as concepts, I recommend you focus on. If it got bolded and underlined in a lecture, I highly recommend that you take a look at it. If I were a high school teacher and I were to give you a pre-written final exam review, like a packet of all the things you need to know for the exam, anything that got bolded and underlined in those lectures would be on the vocab list. So yeah, that would be my initial recommendation for that sort of thing. Anything else? I will literally answer anything and everything that I can. Preference given to actual topical questions about the class content. Deeply personal questions I will probably answer, but I reserve the right to reject for privacy reasons. Insulting questions I will kind of laugh at. Anything and everything I can do to help. Anything you're just curious about. I've gotten at least one email of people fulfilling that final journal requirement of having to do one of 3 things with your questions. That is either asking them, studying them, which is the I don't want to do any extra work, and or I think I can find the answers option, or emailing them. At least 1 or 2 of those emails have been on general philosophical questions that went far above and beyond our class, so I will happily still try and answer those. Yes, so from quiz 4, there was a true-false question that states, biocentrism entails that we ought to treat all living things, from humans down to insects, equally. And the answer is false. It tells only that all living things have moral status, etc. Is this saying that when we're referring to treatment in this sense, it's related to moral consideration, not status? No, technically, no. So the final question, is this saying that when we are referring to treatment in this sense, it's related to moral consideration, not moral status? No, long question's fine. But the way you phrase that is the wrong sort of point that I'm trying to make with that response. So there's not a mistake with the question. It's meant to be slightly challenging and not full-on trick question. And there's 2 things, I guess, for me to say on to that one to answer your question. Two parts. First off, moral consideration and moral status are almost the exact same thing. Moral consideration is what moral status says that something is worthy of. So to have moral status is to be worthy of moral consideration. So for one, the two concepts of moral consideration and moral status, they're not identical, but they're very closely related. So they're not all that different in the way that your question might imply that they are. Two, the reason why the answer to that question is false, the reason why it's false that biocentrism entails that we have to treat all living things equally is precisely because biocentrism is honestly, as far as definitions go, it's a very narrow concept. Biocentrism is about what things have moral status. And so biocentrism says that living things are what has moral status, and all living things have moral status. But the concept of moral status itself allows for different degrees of it. Everything may be worthy of moral consideration. Like say all living things are, say biocentrism is true. All living things might be worthy of moral consideration. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't give more weight or preference to, say, human beings or to vertebrates or to sentient creatures. So there are different ways that I can still rank and organize all living things in terms of how much moral status they have. And that does not make biocentrism false. I can be both a biocentrist and a species non-egalitarian. I can think that all living things deserve moral consideration, but still think that ants are at the bottom of the priority list, or think that there's nothing wrong with mowing my grass. I should still give, say, plants like the grass in my lawn moral consideration insofar as like, well, if I'm gonna like just kill my grass for no reason, like if I just want to take Roundup and just soak my front yard in it, if I had a front yard, doing that for fun is still kind of messed up because I'm just killing a whole bunch of living things for no reason. So we might still say that the grass gets moral consideration, but it might get the smallest amount of moral consideration possible, and I still vastly give preference to human beings or dogs or vertebrates or whatever category I might want to prioritize. So that question and the answer to it in particular is about being precise with our definitions. For one, it's testing to see whether or not you can see that biocentrism and species egalitarian, non-egalitarianism, that these things can be related in different ways. But really the question's about being precise with our definitions. If biocentrism just says everything gets moral consideration, that's all that definition says. It might imply other things down the road, like you can be one of two different sorts, or when I take it together with the definition of moral status, I can see that things come in degrees. One of the goals of philosophy is thinking carefully about big questions. It's investigating the fundamental principles of things and trying to get our thoughts and our language to be more precise, because speaking and expressing ourselves clearly is a necessary step for thinking clearly. So being careful with our definitions is actually a big thing for all of this, which is why a lot of the essays and readings we've been looking at work the way that they do. Glad that helps. Any other questions on that sort of topic while we're discussing it? I'm glad that did help clear some things up, though. You're not the only one that had asked about that question. A couple of people were not happy with the way that one was phrased. If not on that topic, any other questions at all? Anything from the course, about the exam, anything you're curious about? There's literally down to 3 of y'all, so I will answer and address anything that I can. Feel free to take the floor, so to speak. Excuse me. Anything at all, I'd be more than happy to answer and try and help with. To borrow a phrase from one of our other professors, are there any questions that you're ashamed to ask? Things that really you should not feel bad about asking. There's no such thing as well, I was about to say there's no such thing as a dumb question. There are dumb questions. It's never wrong or bad to ask a question. Like a dumb question might be something like if I said, the sky is blue, and then you literally ask, is the sky blue? That's a dumb question because you just weren't listening to the first part. But it's never wrong to ask questions. So if you do have questions that you're a bit uncomfortable asking or that you're unsure about, you don't really know if you ought to ask them, let this be the encouragement. Yes, please ask away. Anything I can answer, I'll be happy to. There's no such thing as a bad question. Let's see. Well, we're down to the last 15 minutes or so. So if you guys don't have any other questions, feel free. You can call it quits and sign off if you're not worried about getting answers to things. I will be online for the next 15 minutes answering literally anything and everything that's asked of me. So if you would like to stick around, feel free. But if you're not worried about questions and you feel good about things, you don't care about what other people might ask, and you don't really care to sit around and watch, let this be me saying, feel free to go if you would like, or if you've got other things to look at. I know that right before finals is a terrible, terrible time with lots of things going on. So I will be here, though, for the next 15 minutes. I will start whistling to myself if I have to. Even if there are no current viewers, I will sit here waiting in case somebody shows up. So anything and everything, fire away. I will answer. I will say that I do appreciate you guys having taken the time to show up for the review. Scheduling these things is always hard. I know that I've inevitably chosen times that don't work for everybody. I know that in particular, this one overlaps with the Purdue basketball game, which is unfortunate. It's about the only time that I could do it and still not interfere with other people's finals and for studying next week. So appreciate those of y'all who came out and took the time to watch this. Those who are watching it after the fact, I'm glad that you guys took the time to do that. Even if you couldn't make it to the live stream, I'm glad that you did take the time to watch this after the fact, to go over some of the questions. It just proves that you're a good student. You may not think of yourself that way, but if you care at least that much, I guarantee you are a good student, at least to that degree. So pat yourself on the back for that one if you did take the time after the fact. Should you try and incorporate as much vocab as you can into your writings? And this is where part of the subjective side of this sort of thing does come in a little bit. If you can bring in terms that you're not asked to explain and refer to as part of the essay, and you do so in a way that helps demonstrate a fuller appreciation of the subject, your thesis, and the problem being discussed, that will help your response. So for example, take something like, let's go back to the midterm for a second. The just war question with the hobbits of the Shire and Mordor. If you had, say, done everything I asked of you, which was to explain just war theory as part of your answer, that was all that was actually asked of you in that prompt. Most of you also drew connections to the jus ad bellum, which is intentional. That's meant to be the next part of it. That's technically a vocab term I didn't ask about in the original prompt, but bringing it up helps show a fuller understanding of the problem. If you had gone even further, and let's say that in particular, you said that yes, it's justified, but the hobbits are justified in fighting back because relativism is true, because I think there is no objective fact of the matter. Both of them are justified from their own individual positions, and so long as the nations of Mordor and the Shire agree and believe that their cause is justified, then it actually is. That's another case of bringing in vocab and concepts that are related to what's going on and using it to help better and more fully explain your position, the arguments, and everything going on. So don't bring in vocab just for the sake of bringing in vocab. Name dropping all the different terms we've referred to does not help with things. So if you say, oh, well, this is relevant, and this is relevant, and this is relevant, just listing off the different concepts does not make your essay better. But if the concepts are related, if they give a better and more full understanding of the problem, if they help show another side to the problem that helps either answer your help support your thesis, or shows some of the challenges to your thesis that you can then respond to, that sort of thing does help, because it does help you get into that A-level set of requirements of showing a full appreciation of the problem, and that you can discuss your view and the concepts involved with nuance in addition to the main details. So, short version, to answer your question, no, you shouldn't necessarily try to incorporate as much vocab as you can in the writing. Bad strategy. But if there are other terms that seem relevant and can help deepen the discussion, if they can help show a more full appreciation of the problem and the concepts, feel free to add those in, because they can help. It's not necessary, and it doesn't necessarily make it better on its own. But if done well, it can help with the response. Does that make sense, or is that still kind of clear as mud? Awesome, good. Glad to help. It's literally what they pay me for. Anything else? Any questions at all? Anything at all, I will happily answer for the next 10 minutes. Hopefully y'all's finals weeks will go all right. I started to say hopefully your finals week is going well, but I guess for most of you actually haven't started taking any exams yet. This is probably the only sort of class that may start to do exams, because technically they're supposed to happen during finals week. I think we're actually instructed not to give them prior to that. But hopefully your semester's wrapping up pretty well overall. Anything else, I will happily answer, or discuss, or just chat, or hang out. Again, for another 8-ish minutes. If there are other questions, if there are ones that take more discussion, I do have a little bit of buffer built into my time between this one and my next review, which happens in another half hour. So if we need to go over by a few minutes because you have a long question or something, feel free. I will still answer it and we can go over a little. Again, the benefits of this not actually being a classroom review session or anything like that. Nobody's fighting for the room immediately after me. I guess I will say as well, hopefully, what's my dissertation about, or have I started it? Yes, I have started it. I am halfway through my 6th year. In particular, my dissertation is about meta-ethics, actually. So not only do I teach these sorts of things as intro classes, but this is my area of specialty in general. So my thesis has to do with the fundamental building blocks of how obligation and value relate to each other. In particular, I'm arguing with my dissertation that it's possible for an action to be both morally right and morally bad, that is, to totally lack moral value, for us to be required to do objectively bad things, not just costly to us or bad for the people around us, but from the perspective of the universe, if you want to phrase it that way. Morality and duty can ask us and require us to do things that are bad, things that benefit nobody, that have no redeeming value, and yet are still the morally right thing to do. And it's because I think value and morality in general is structured in a certain way. And so my dissertation basically argues for the possibility of that and shows how that changes our view of how morality works, and basically how value and obligation fit together in certain ways. Still a lot of writing to go. I'm not out of here probably for a year, but that's what I'm working on. So stuff that doesn't come up a whole lot in this class, but is related to the things we started the semester with. And you can bring it up with just about everything else if you really were to try. In particular, I guess anytime you start getting into consequentialist stuff, it can come up because, well, thank you. I'm glad it sounds interesting to at least somebody besides me. I will say the other nice thing about it is even though it's mostly purely theoretical stuff, it actually has direct applications for a couple of the things we've talked about. Can you take the final early? Yes, you can take the final right now. If you wanted to, you could literally open up another tab in your browser, go to Blackboard, open the link, and take it right this moment. You could have taken it yesterday if you wanted. There are no time restrictions on it aside from you have 2 hours from the moment you started. So if you want to be done with the semester tonight, you can. If you have everything submitted and the final done, you're done. I got nothing else for you. Grades will be done and turned in. I'm required to turn in grades by 5 p.m. on the 18th, which means you can't do anything too close to that deadline because I have to be able to grade stuff. But 5 p.m. on the 18th, the entire semester's done. So long as you have everything turned in before then, you're good. There's nothing else that is asked of you. Everything you need to do is available. So long as you get it done, you can be done with this. It's one of the reasons why I scheduled the review as early as I did. I could have scheduled it for like the weekend or first part of next week to avoid the basketball game, but that would have dragged out a lot of people taking the final. So feel free. If you want to be done with it tonight, you are more than welcome to. I won't promise that I'll have your final graded until next weekend because I generally try and do them all together. But I guess in theory, if you did get it done early enough and enough of you got it done early enough where I could grade them without knowing who did what, because trying to do them anonymously is a principle of mine, so that I can do it without as much bias as possible. Because again, I'm an ethicist. This is what I specialize in. So I try and be as fair and as not cruel as possible with these things. So I guess if enough of you did exams where I could grade you in a group and not have any bias in the responses, you might have grades before they're actually due. But you will at least know what you made on everything by 5 p.m. on the 18th. And then generally 8 a.m. the next morning is when all the actual official final grades are released to your transcripts and through MyPurdue and all that good stuff. So yes, you can take it early. You might even be able to find out what you made on it early. At minimum, you will find out what you made on everything by 5 p.m. on December the 18th. But yeah, if you want to finish early, I more than welcome you to do so. Because I know that most of you probably have multiple classes, multiple finals, and the sooner you're done with these, the better. Or if you've got a lot of shit and you just want to wait on this until after your other ones are done, if all your finals are on Monday and Tuesday, this one can wait a little bit longer. You take it whenever it works for you. We've got at least a couple of students who are outside the U.S., and so time zones I know are an issue. I've gotten a lot of emails at 1 a.m. from a couple of you. So I know that you're at least signing in from somewhere besides West Lafayette. I mean, that's not to say that you're not welcome to send me messages any time of the day. I won't answer them at 1 a.m. for sure. But I know at least some of you are probably night owls as well. So time alone is not a good indicator. And I'm rambling, I know, because we were down to the last couple of minutes and there aren't other questions. I know the first time I taught online classes, I guess it was 2 years ago, I had a lot of students in Beijing for some reason who were taking the class over the summer, I guess either before or after they had spent semesters here in the States. So I know that I get international students, both international students at Purdue in person and students who are abroad while taking all this. So if you're one of those, hopefully you've enjoyed the class. Welcome. Long belated welcome. So we are at the end of regulation time. That is, we've been on here for an hour, officially an hour. Yes, technically it's been an hour and 5 minutes. That's all that I set out to do. So unless there are any other final questions, this will be the end of the review. I'll cut off the live stream. Video will be posted to YouTube. If you need to go over this later, or if people are, those of you in the future who are watching this, any final questions be added to the chat and answered before I sign off for now. Any final questions? We'll give you 30 seconds. "15 seconds for any of you with slow fingers. Merry Christmas to you. Happy holidays to you if you don't celebrate Christmas. Thanks for being part of this, guys. I hope it's been a good semester. I know it's been rocky at a couple of points for unavoidable reasons. It's not been the best semester, but hopefully you enjoyed the class. Hopefully you got a lot out of it. And I highly encourage you, if you did enjoy it, and if you find this stuff interesting, to look into more philosophy classes in the future, because there's a lot more stuff to get into. A lot of really cool questions, a lot of really cool topics, both in ethics and outside of it. So yeah, proud of you guys. Thanks for sticking through all this. Hope you guys have a fantastic end of your semester. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and I will see you around. Happy thinking, guys. Cheers.